explore how disruption occurs with lessons learned from other industries, especially the food industry. So I will be moderating this discussion, and I'd like to welcome to the stage our panelists, Catherine Tubb, Head of Textiles at Planet Tracker, Stephen Chambers, Managing Director of IndieBio, Macy Marriott, Director at Glasswall Syndicate, Jamie Arbib, founder of RethinkX, and Mark Post, Chief Scientific Officer of Qorium. And again, we'll have some time for audience questions at the end, so please do post them in the chat. And I would love to now have each of the panelists, give us about 3 to 5 minutes about yourself and your organization, and specifically how you're involved in disruptive technologies. And I'll call on everyone to make it easier, and in no particular order. I'm just going based on the screen. So Catherine, I'll head it over to you first.
Hi everyone, my name's Catherine Tubb. I helped to co-author RethinkX.
All right, I can't hear you that well.
Hello?
No, not really. All right, let me let you handle.
Catherine, if you go onto your settings, click on audio, and then turn your volume right up, that should hopefully help the problem.
Okay, while you're doing that, then I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Hi, everybody. Hope you can hear me.
We can, thanks.
Okay, so I'm Managing Director at IndieBio here in New York. I'm also a general partner at SOSV, which is the VC company behind IndieBio. So, we have a kind of investment thesis that covers human and planetary health. So we make a large number of investments in the sustainability area, and we have done, as was alluded to in the introduction, a number of investments in on the food side of things. Some companies you might know: Upside Food, which was Memphis Meats, Geltor, Perfect Day, Notco. So a number of companies were startups that are now, in the case of Notco, a unicorn kind of just last year, has done phenomenally well. Very much in the kind of alternative, milk without the cow, as Notco would say, kind of very much on the sustainability, alternative proteins, substituting for meat-based proteins. So that's the kind of area that we kind of work in, very much human and planetary health. And we have started to make a number of investments around kind of the material space, let's call it. Some of those investments have been Alginate, MycoWorks, Tomtex, Bucha, very much kind of utilizing alternative biopolymers, bioproteins that can be used to make novel materials. So that's our space that we work in.
Thank you so much. Okay, Mark.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so I have co-founded 2 companies, Mozambique, which is now like 135 people, and aims to commercialize cultivated meat, as there are now 100 companies, I guess. And Qorium, same technology essentially, but then to produce leather. So with these 2 products, except for milk, we're kind of replacing the cow. And of course, they are complementary, and they're also quite similar in technology. I come from the technical side, and this, being in this disruptive area kind of happened to me accidentally. I was just working on a couple of technologies, then realized that these could have a major impact in other fields than the traditional medical field that I was working in, and that kind of happened.
Oh, thank you. And Jamie.
Hi there. So I'm Jamie Arbib. I have spent 20 years as a clean tech investor. I also set up a foundation that supported climate change innovations. And about 6 years ago, I set up another organization called RethinkX, which is a not-for-profit research group. And really, RethinkX came about because what I was seeing in the tech space was not being reflected in what I was hearing in the climate space. So 8 or so years ago, I began to feel that the kind of the doom and gloom and the failure to understand that we have technological solutions to many of our problems was leading us to poor decision making. And so RethinkX seeks to address that. We use a complex systems modeling approach to try and understand how technology disruptions unfold, because technology disruptions are not linear. The pattern of change in any complex system is one of long periods of kind of equilibrium or stasis, interspersed with these periods of rapid transformation. And the kind of linear view we tend to have when we look forward, we look to the past, we draw a straight line to today, we extrapolate it straight into the future, leads us to very bad kind of forecasts when we come up to a period of disruption. It's fine in that equilibrium phase when we can just assume that everything stays the same. But disruptions occur in S-curves. They're non-linear. They go very rapidly once they start. And we believe that we're standing at the moment on the cusp of major disruptions to every sector of our economy: transportation, energy, food, materials, healthcare, education, and so on. And that society is totally unprepared for them. To take decisions about anything in society, our education system, our healthcare system, our pension system, our energy system, we need better understanding of what the future possibilities are. And so that's what we try and do at RethinkX, because generally we stumble into these disruptions and we kind of clean up the mess retrospectively. The jobs lost, the communities destroyed, the investments lost. And our goal is to try and help decision makers across society, governments, investors, businesses, take better decisions based on a better understanding of what's coming. I mean, disruption, and I know we're going to get into this later on, it's not just a simple substitution. This is not about replacing a cow burger for a novel protein burger, or replacing a gas or coal-fired power plant with a solar PV plant, or a gasoline vehicle with an electric vehicle. It's about a fundamental systems change. Everything changes in the system. We call it a phase transformation. I mean, Buckminster Fuller once said that there's nothing about a caterpillar that tells you it's going to be a butterfly. And that kind of sums up what disruption's about. It's about a transformation of the system. And if we don't understand that, we end up trying to kind of make the old system, the caterpillar, less bad, instead of enabling this new system that's emerging to emerge and replace it. And so that's RethinkX, and that's what we're up to.
I have not heard that quotation before. I love it. I'm going to have to go research that. We have some other Buckminster Fuller quotations we love too. And actually, I will talk about it after everyone does their introduction. But exactly what you said is why I wanted to add this panel into the conference, and why I decided to chair it myself, is because I do worry that industry is not ready, and that the innovation and the disruption will happen very quickly. And I want to do our part in helping the industry prepare. So we'll get back to that. Macy.
Hi, well, thank you so much, Nicole, for having me on this panel, and excited to be here. So I'm the director of Glasswell Syndicate. We are the largest investor network in the plant and cell-based space. We started back in 2017. Where our focus is removing animals from the supply chain, but that really manifested with a focus on alternative protein, but we're starting to focus more on next generation materials now. 2017, as everyone here knows, the landscape looked very different than it does today for alt protein. I'm also part of the Straight Out Capital team. We had been making investments in the space, and there were really just a handful of investors that were hyper-focused on alternative protein. And so we thought that there was an opportunity for collaboration and to really drive partnership between early stage startups and like-minded, mission-driven investors. Started with a handful, and the next thing we knew, we had 50 investors, and then 100 investors, and then 150 investors, and now we have 220 investors within Glasswell Syndicate. About 80% are stateside, about 20% international. About 60% of our members are angels. About 40% are part of funds or family offices. So really runs the gamut of anywhere from $25,000 per deal check writers to $1 million per deal check writers. Just really focuses on that collaborative element within venture capital. And we are really excited about the growth that we've witnessed kind of happen over the last several years, and starting to really pivot into how we can introduce next generation material companies into the deal flow within the network. We're actually a nonprofit, so not everybody always knows that right off the get-go. We're a 501c6, so we're just on a mission to remove animals from the supply chain and bring people together and kind of play matchmaker. We have pitch events every other month. We have, a very robust deal flow sourcing pipeline, and once we have our pitch events, we break out into very streamlined deal teams so that we're able to evaluate companies in a very collaborative format, which obviously is really important in venture capital, especially for angels. And I know we'll kind of get into this later, but this is new. So same with Alt Protein several years ago, there were lots of angels out there. A lot of our angels have day jobs. They are eye doctors by day and investors by night. So they're not necessarily always integrated into the venture capital day to day. And so being able to provide them with deal flow and provide them with other investors to learn from, and partners like MII, like GFI, to be able to just feel like you are comfortable with the due diligence process and ultimately making investments that hopefully will have a large, financial return, but also a large impact return. So just really excited to be here and chat with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Macy. And Catherine.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Much better.
Okay. Good, that's a relief. So hi everyone, I'm Catherine Tubb and I'm currently the head of textiles at Planet Tracker. Planet Tracker is a not-for-profit aiming to enable investors to place value on natural capital and price that natural capital risk accordingly, and then for them to ultimately make decisions based on it. We operate across 4 workflows, of which textiles is one of them. And then previously to that job, I was actually also at RethinkX alongside Jamie and was the co-author of the Disruption of the Cow report that we did. So I'm very familiar with all the technologies around alternative proteins, and have recently written a blog for Planet Tracker, but looking at how that kind of same methodology could be applied to materials. So I've always been quite interested in materials as we've seen those same technologies come to play, and then especially moving into the textile space, where we've seen a lot of kind of interest from some of the people we talk to about the next gen. But it is just part of the story for sure on textiles. There's a few more challenges, I think, going on in that space.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And I just added the link to Catherine's recent blog that I think came out like 2 days ago to the chat. So I highly recommend checking that out. And so I would like to give a little bit of background for myself in this panel. So I did spend a few years in the food industry before coming over to the Material Innovation Initiative, and saw how quickly the food industry expanded in a short amount of time. So I started in the food industry in 2017, so same time as Macy started Glass Walls. And within those 2 years, we did like a back of the envelope calculation. The increase of the number of players in the space rose 1,200% in just 3 years. Like, it was really incredible how quickly the industry developed. And that was not only startups, but scientists who entered the space, investors. And so I really do think we're going to see the same thing in materials. And so this whole panel is people who have experience in both the food industry and are now moving into materials. And so my hope is that in the next hour, we can help the industry understand through our learnings in the food industry and now what we're seeing in materials, what happened there, maybe some lessons learned on what we could have done better in the food industry, or maybe what we wish we'd known, and our recommendations for fashion, automotive, home goods, anyone in this new materials industry. So actually, Catherine, since we started talking about the blog post, let me pass it over to you. I'd love to hear more about the blog post, and maybe if you could give everyone just a quick summary, because they won't have time to read it right now.
Sure. So I guess it kind of goes through the idea of disruption and how it happens with leather in particular. And I think, we are seeing those, as we've already heard, some of those kind of same potentially disruptive technologies that food is seeing. So around kind of fermentation, cell-based and plant-based products. And of course, then you have this idea that leather is also particularly related to the food system, as again, that has also been touched upon, and I'm sure people will talk about more. And so we just really wanted to show in the blog post that it's not just meat and milk that's susceptible to disruption from economic factors, but leather as well. And then even show perhaps why leather could be faster than food and even help kind of drive food disruption. In fact, we see them probably being feedback loops into each other. And then breaking down what that would mean for investors and the unexpected financial environmental consequences if that would happen, say, faster than expected. So I guess the beginning part of the blog, I lay out particularly why it's going to be an economic disruption. And to understand that, you often have to understand the incumbent industry. So, the annual leather goods market is worth about $400 billion, with almost over 60% coming from cows. And why is it going to be disrupted? Well, it's an incredibly inefficient industry. Hides are limited in size and shape. Quality is highly variable. The supply chain is really fragmented and low margin, and production time is in years. There's a huge amount of waste, not only from the processing, but just dealing with those non-conventional shapes. So I think there's about 30 to 40% of the cowhide by area is lost, and almost 80% by weight during that processing. And then top of this, only a small percentage of hides are actually graded at that highest quality level. And then, of course, there's the environmental impacts from processing hides, which Stephen touched on. And of course, just requiring a huge amount of chemicals and water to process them. So how is this disruption going to happen? In the blog post, we say, well, like for food, it's going to be a business-to-business disruption. There are very few, if any, instances where consumers purchase a hide directly from a cow. Or even use a sheet of tan leather. And that's because it's companies, right, not consumers, who are going to decide what raw materials to use in their products. So if we think about it as similar in a way that leather is usually an ingredient in the end product sold to consumers, like shoes or handbags or in cars. And so, of course, companies will switch far more quickly to something if it's proved to be better and cheaper than the alternative. And that's the key kind of facet of the work we do at RethinkX, about how do you make something cheaper and better. And once it's at that point, often it starts getting adopted pretty quickly. So, and since materials typically go on the body, not inside them, there are going to be far fewer regulatory hurdles and personal trepidations than with food. And so I'd argue the barrier to entry is actually lower than for food. So adoption is going to be probably faster. And then it will probably be a lot quicker than expected for a couple of reasons. Economically, we know hides represent 2 to 5% of the value of a carcass to meat packers, which is a relatively small amount, but profits in the beef cattle industry are very volatile and small. I mean, they're actually quite high at the moment, but they're very usually volatile. And so a prolonged period of reduced demand for hides is going to leave damaged margins in their wake. And of course, we're seeing the simultaneous disruption of food. So you're going to see kind of two downward pressures on those margins. So actually what we'll probably see is that food material tipping point quite close together. And then what are the implications, I guess, that if that does happen quickly, especially as an ESG investor, who are often the people that we talk to, if you pick the winners, what are the implications of that? Environmentally, what are the impacts? If it were to halt deforestation, but kind of what other raw materials are going to be used and required? There's unintended consequences, exactly as Jamie mentioned. How are we going to make sure we mitigate those downside risks and really promote the good parts of this disruption? And the textiles industry generally has a lot of more environmental challenges associated with it. So how do those challenges, those new materials fit in with those kind of challenges?
Thank you so much, Catherine. So much information there. And actually, I think what you said a lot about the inefficiencies, right, of the system, and that's how disruption occurs. And Jamie, I'd love to pass it over to you with a broader expertise of disruption in a number of different industries. Are there general principles of disruption that we should be considering? And are there maybe signs that the fashion industry, materials industry should be looking at to prepare themselves for a change?
Yeah, certainly there are. And we've created a framework which we are now applying to various different industries. And the patterns are incredibly consistent, industry after industry. So maybe I'll draw from a few different disruptions and just talk you through the process of disruption and how it tends to unfold. So, I mean, really the driver of disruption, or the primary driver of disruption, is the cost and capability of new technologies against the old. So, we see new technologies emerge, and get on a cost curve, and they come down over time in cost and they improve in capability. And then they begin to find markets. And there are various models of disruption. There's the sort of Tesla or electric vehicle model of disruption, which is what we term disruption from above. So, it's a higher cost product, it's a better quality product, and it comes in at the top of the market and begins to disrupt that. Then as costs come down, it opens up a bigger and bigger market, and eventually goes into the low end of the market. There's sort of disruption from below, which is I guess a Clayton Christian model of disruption, where you have a new technology that's cheaper, but the capabilities aren't so good. And one of his classic examples is steel mills. And so you start with the lowest quality products, and then as capabilities improve, you begin to take out the other slices of the market. And then there's what we term big bang disruption, which is the idea that a new product comes in that's both better and cheaper than the existing products. And for instance, transport as a service, when we get autonomous electric vehicles and they're capable of driving our roads, that'll be a big bang disruption, because they're immediately much lower cost, 10x cheaper than driving your own car, and a better quality product. Same in new drug treatments and so on that come into the market, often quickly disrupt new markets. But then adoption of new products kind of goes along an S-curve. We've talked about that, and we've seen time and time again that disruptions happen in roughly the same time. Somewhere around 15 years from the market reaching sort of 2-3 market to essentially completely disrupting the market, getting up above 80% of the market. And that's because as disruptions unfold, it triggers feedback loops, right? So you get both a kind of vicious cycle for the old industry and a virtuous cycle for the new. So the virtuous cycle comes as we get increasing demand, we get increasing economies of scale, we get less cost, we see investors beginning to move money from the old to the new, we begin to see regulation changing to support the new industry. It had better kind of consequences than the old industry. We see public opinion beginning to change, demand patterns shifting, and that creates a virtuous cycle where the costs continue to come down, demand increases. And on the other side of the coin, for the incumbent industry, you get the opposite. You get decreasing demand, reversing economies of scale, you get increasing costs, you get the supply chains perhaps beginning to break down, investment floods out. If they're on very thin margins, these industries can collapse very quickly, very early on in that industry, and you see a phase of consolidation and bankruptcy and so on and so forth. And that's what drives that S-curve, that's what drives that non-linearity. And I think I said earlier, it represents a phase transformation. It represents a fundamentally, different market system or different value chain out of the other side of that disruption. And it also has kind of cascading consequences. So, when the car came along and disrupted the horse, it didn't just change transportation. Cars could go faster, they could carry more load, they could do all kinds of things that horses couldn't. So, the amount of miles covered in the transport market exploded. We had a vastly bigger, an order of magnitude bigger market within 10 years of the car coming along. We changed the way we lived, the way we worked, where we built our schools, hospitals, and so on, the way we designed our towns. New farmland became economic because we could get the produce to market quickly enough for new fields to become viable. Transformed geopolitics, as the 20th century was kind of the century of oil in many ways. So, profound consequences of disruption. And you also get feedbacks between the sectors. Transformation of the energy system, for instance, can create new opportunities and entirely new businesses elsewhere in the economy. So you kind of have to look at a kind of holistic approach. You have to try and understand the whole, as well as understand these kind of systems dynamics and forces that drive disruption. But yes, absolutely, time and time again, these disruptions happen quickly, and we would expect in the food space, which Catherine co-authored the report on for us, and in the material space, the same dynamics to happen. I mean, these are complex systems, and the same processes are at work.
Thank you so much. So I heard you say 15 years is generally the time frame. I know I'm going to put you on the spot, but if a number of these companies started about 10 years ago. Are we looking for major disruption in maybe 5 years?
No, because this is from a kind of a market. This is from when you get to a certain point of penetration in the market. So, there's a startup phase prior to that when they're sort of pre-market. But these disruptions, I mean, what we're seeing is actually a compression of that, that time. So I would expect, once they begin to, start that disruptive phase, that it will happen very quickly, and that these feedback loops will through, because we've got so much disruption going on in tandem in other sectors. And as Catherine mentioned, the cow, serves a number of different markets. And I have to mention that the term carcass balancing, just because I think it's such an extraordinary thing to do. But a cow goes into hundreds of different products, right? We break it down into all kinds of things. I mean, we have the easy to access things like the hide and the steak, the meat, and so on. But all kinds of other parts get processed into kind of collagen or insulin, or the milk into whey and casein and so on and so forth. And as you begin to disrupt those subsidiary markets, those kind of single molecules, and then the slightly more complex process through novel production technologies, you cause some real adverse consequences, because you no longer are those outputs from a carcass an asset. You won't be able to sell them. If we can produce leather that's better and at lower cost, and so no longer can we sell the hide, that has a huge impact. Maybe that becomes a liability. Actually, maybe now you have to pay to dispose of it. Right? So we'll get to a point, we think, as we get into the 2030s, where we're really producing cows just for the meat, and the cost of that meat will be enormous compared to today, because it will have to support the full cost of the cow, and an industry and a processing industry then that's much less efficient. None of the economies of scale of the industry today. So that's kind of how disruption happens, and that's why we think this will be particularly fast, because you get this convergence of sectors that drives some really kind of nasty outcomes for incumbent industries.
Well, thank you. And
can I interrupt for a second? Because what is important really here is what you call disruption, because I guess there's a time factor, right? And you say, okay, the disruptive industries evolve or take over a market within 12 to 30 years after entry to the market, but that means that time factor is kind of incorporated into your definition of disruption, right? Or your description of disruption. If it takes longer, you no longer call it a disruption. Is that correct, or do I see this wrong?
No, I mean, it's if the market is disrupted over a longer time period, it's still a disruption.
But why? So things change, and not every change is disruptive. It can also go gradual, and people adapt, and they sometimes even hardly notice that there is change because it goes so slow.
Yeah, so you do get disruptions where the cost and capabilities of the products are not better, and we don't trigger those feedback loops. So the difference between the two gets greater and greater. So as we see the cost of proteins, for instance, coming down and continuing to drop, we'll see the cost of cow products beginning to go up, and that creates a diversion. You do get some disruptions where you don't trigger those feedback loops, but I would expect in this market that we would.
Right. Well, but there's also the manufacturing side. If a lot of these technologies are completely new manufacturing technologies, and they're massive sort of scales at which you need to produce. So in order to build up the manufacturing capacity, it just takes a lot of time and a lot of capital.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's also a factor, specifically for this industry, where you transform something that is quote unquote natural to something that is a more industrialized process, including factories, steel, fermenters, education of personnel. They're all taking time.
Yeah. No, yeah. No, I hear you, Mark, and I understand that. And yes, we're not at that point. We're not at the start of that, 10 or 15 year period yet, because we're not at the kind of level of market penetration. But what I will say, if you go back in time, let's go back to say 1905 in America, right, and look at the disruption of the horse, right, another animal, by the car. At that point in time, you had gasoline vehicles that just really didn't work. They weren't good quality. They broke down all the time. You had none of the infrastructure you needed, right? You had very few paved roads. You had very few. You had no real oil industry, right? We were producing oil for kerosene. We had to develop, some key processes for oil refining. We had no trained mechanics, right? You wanted to service your car, you went to your blacksmith. Right, so real barriers, major issues to overcome, and yet, in 1905, about 2.5% of the vehicles on the road were cars. 20 years later, 1925, and this is 100 years ago essentially, you get to 95% of vehicles being cars. Right, so yes, these look like huge hurdles. They look enormous, and I'm not talking about the technological side, but I'm talking about when the technology is proven. They look like huge hurdles, but actually, in reality, it's certainly in that disruption, they turned out to be speed bumps.
And just one quick comment. I noticed, Mark, that you had mentioned manufacturing, and this is actually something that we've been talking about a lot with our investor network, looking at the alternative protein side, and I would love to hear what the rest of the group thinks as well. One of the challenges that we see within alternative proteins is, there's very limited government involvement in infrastructure. And so as we have alternative protein companies that are raising Series B rounds and Series C rounds, they're having to raise an extensive amount of capital, because a lot of that is going into manufacturing and infrastructure that's not being, provided by the government. And so it really becomes this valley of death at Series B and Series C to be able to try to get that round at that large of a round, especially because, you've kind of outgrown venture capital, family offices, and the check size that they can write. But as you start going to some of those institutional investors, they have very specific revenue thresholds where a lot of these technology companies are probably going to be raising super large rounds. Technically, they're growth stage and that they're raising Series B, Series C, but their revenue and sales are either pre-revenue or very small. So this is a challenge that we've been talking about a lot. And, the government may throw $1 million grant here and $1 million grant there, but in comparison to 38 billion, I think it is, in annual subsidies, U.S. subsidies for meat and dairy, like it's a drop in the bucket. And so we're constantly talking about government involvement and infrastructure. And I'm just curious, it's a challenge that we have on the alt protein side. If anyone has any thoughts on if there's going to be parallels there within manufacturing and next gen materials.
So that production capacity has always been an issue. Like it has been on the protein therapeutic side of things. So it's always been out there. There's like past 20 years, people have been saying there aren't enough fermenters. And, so I would caution looking to government for, assistance there. Like there are a number of corporates that are moving into this, particularly kind of the brewing industry. Where they have huge amount of capacity, they have a huge amount of raw materials as well that they would consider waste that could also be the carbon sources for a lot of these products on the fermentation side of things. So what we're seeing is that the CapEx side of things is kind of an issue. And I could talk about the scaling up of the opportunities all day long here as well, because I think a lot of the companies, they minimize that side of being able to scale up. What if we're not careful, what's going to happen is the sustainability is going to be the new luxury. And I don't think that's the way we really want to go. We really do want to meet the mass market side of things to really get sustainability, not just a niche consumer that can afford these products. So like the scalability side of things is like a huge problem, but I don't think you can put it all at the fermentation side of things or the production side of things. Like there's a number of other things that are in the way of doing that. We're seeing companies that go really fast, that have really good traction and get really good cadence, are the ones that have sorted out maybe not the large scale production side of things, but the kind of like the medium scale production side of things. Definitely the companies that are able to get products to the corporates, to the manufacturers, like they tend to go very, very fast in terms of their traction and progress that they make.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree that I wouldn't also look too much to the government. I've been trying this for the last 10 years as originally coming from mostly a publicly funded person. And it's just very hard. And it's exactly because of the potential disruptive nature that it is hard. It's quite difficult for politicians to choose to kind of start investing into something that they know will antagonize some of their voters.
Yeah. Can I just comment there? So I'd agree. I mean, but I'd also say we've seen in other industries, solar particularly, and electric vehicles to some degree, but there has been government assistance that's kind of helped get the ball rolling, that sort of accelerated those cost curves. Either subsidies that are sort of bring down the cost, they artificially sort of bring forward the date of kind of cost competitiveness. And those can be super helpful. They kind of, they get the boulder rolling down the hill, and market forces then can take over. And that's, for me, that's a secret of government intervention, is to get these disruptive products and services to the point where market forces can take over. And so it would be great to think that we could see that. And we've obviously seen in a number of other areas where government interventions actually helped with the infrastructure, electric power, in building the roads for the transportation sector. So I wouldn't hold on for government intervention, but actually, one of the things that we try to do when we speak to governments is try and kind of catalyze a race to the top. Right, there's huge advantage to regions or cities or nations that lead on these. These are going to be huge industries, materials and food. And so there are real reasons why government should get behind it, to try and catalyze these changes, to reduce the regulatory barriers in order to create the wealth and jobs that come with kind of global technology leadership. So I think it's, whilst I'm not holding my breath for it, I think there are very good reasons why we might see certain regions of the world really get behind these technologies and accelerate them in the way they have other things.
Right, but those are likely going to be the countries that don't have any agricultural kind of power to begin with, right? So the Singapores and the Israels of this Israel is an agricultural country, but not for meat and for leather. So I think that's where indeed where the opportunity is. The the Arabic states everywhere where you cannot really perform regular agriculture, though, and where there's sufficient capital to start working on this and sufficient vision to start working on this. There you see the activity.
Well, and I can say too, from our conversations with people, we have seen governments more interested in this area. There are a couple countries in Europe that consider themselves, textile leaders, and are looking to attract these new companies and investors with those tax incentives. And we did even see in the United States, there's some talk in New York City about revitalizing the garment district and what that means. Does that mean that we can, attract, more of this, technology into New York? That's a huge option for the city that they see as a potential for the long-term revenue. And then the same with like MycoWorks is another example. They had a decision of where to put their new production facility, and they chose the U.S. I don't know the details of that deal, but I'm sure there's reasons why they're choosing the U.S. over other countries as well. And if countries want to be leaders in this space, they can offer better incentives for these companies, because it is a new technology that will bring a lot of jobs.
Yeah, I'm putting on my ESG hat for a little bit. We've seen that a lot of the production of textiles and leather is done in regions of the global south and in areas of high water risk, things like that. So there is a real incentive for certain companies to start reshoring or to start thinking about alternative areas of production. And that, of course, means that there are incentives for governments to get involved as well. Although obviously I agree with Jamie that it's not going to be government led, it's going to be business led. But like there's a bit of a chat in the side chat going on about what's the difference between cheaper and better. And I think the idea is one person's better is not everyone's better. So the value to one government or one country is very different to the value of another. But that's kind of what continues to drive innovation forward, because essentially if it's more valuable to one country, then more likely to put more money into it and drive it. So
yeah, there are a number of questions about, and Jamie, you touched on this a little bit too, how in order for disruption to happen, there has to be the cost and capabilities. And I think a lot of people are talking about those in particular as, are these new materials really meeting the capabilities needed for the industry? And Stephen, you had made a comment in the chat about we're aiming to try and get these materials better. Do you mind talking?
It's very difficult to, like if you're competing on cost, like when companies come to me and they start telling me that they can do it cheaper and, that sort of, I'm kind of like a bit worried. I like to hear that companies can do it better. They can make it better, because that's what makes people change. Okay, when it's like if you're just producing the same old thing, like that's not a good value proposition. So I push companies very much to come up with, you're going to have to make it significantly better to change behavior. So that's what a lot of the startups are doing now. They're not making, like I kind of like put in the thing, like they're not just making leather, they're making leather better. Like there's other performance characteristics that they're building into this leather, because they have the ability to do it now. They have the power of biology to sort of make the leather better. Like it doesn't have to be the same old leather. It can be, significantly better. So I think that's, like we touched on, like we talked about, the 20th century being the kind of driven by the bioeconomy, but driven by the oil economy. That's changed. Like what's happening now with the basically, the oil industry kind of like running out, we could say, is the bio industry. The bioeconomy is going to drive the next century. So that's what we're looking at. And that's what a lot of this change is being powered by. It's being powered by being able to engineer biology and make significant changes to materials. Okay, so that's what we see as the kind of the driver for a lot of what the companies are doing at the moment.
Yeah, any historical disruption, if you look at, and I'm talking not alternative proteins, I'm thinking way further back than that. The ones that you can see now how much better the products have worked. They never started off like that. So when people are asking in the chat about where are they now, that's not the question we should be asking. We should be asking where they're going to be in 15 years, in 20 years. What does the industry look like? What are the systemic changes to the industry that we're going to have to see to encompass these new products? When we had the first smartphone or mobile phone, we had no idea that it would become this huge. Sorry, I'm stealing all your lines, Jamie. This huge thing that we'd use for everything, right? So how can we make that true of these new materials and alternative proteins? And I think that's we've got to start kind of opening up that space of where we're envisioning these products to be. We're not going to be limited to cow-based leathers, for example. We could make leather from anything. We could make it any color. We could make it any size. I think those are the kind of questions and discussions we should be having, because that's what's going to make it a really disruptive industry. It's not just making it the same.
Yeah, and yeah. I might just, sorry, Stephen,
sorry, you go.
I might just add to that, because I think what you said is absolutely right. I think with materials, this is what we term a disruption from above. It's kind of the Tesla model in some ways of disruption, where you come in at the top of the market and you find niches there. Either kind of environmental or sustainability demand, or just through producing kind of better products. And over time, as costs come down and capabilities continue to improve, you come all the way down through the market and open up a bigger and bigger market. And that's the way we'll disrupt this market. We're starting in that narrow kind of high-end niche that funds it, which is actually the most profitable part of the market for the incumbents. So you cut off their kind of greatest source of profitability, and they begin that kind of death spiral. And so, you know, it makes it easier. And so you get a kind of divergence in many ways between the two industries, and it just becomes self-reinforcing, and the market just keeps opening up and getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, like my worry always is that they just play in the kind of, you know, the top end, the luxury thing. And what we have to do with a lot of our companies is push them to sort of, to open up those other markets. Don't get comfortable in kind of just serving that niche market, but definitely kind of like push down into kind of like bigger markets and other markets. The other thing I would say is that what we're seeing is we were talking about disruption and how quickly it happens. We're seeing companies do that quicker. Okay, so that's one of the things that we've noticed. Like we noticed it in food first. So the kind of getting to market, getting to a much broader market appears to be speeding up. So that kind of like getting to the large scale market, the getting into the supermarkets, getting into the kind of away from the niche brands, but getting to, everybody is speeding up. That's what we're kind of like looking at. We saw it with the food, and we're seeing it with the materials as well now. The speed to mass production is increasing.
Actually, I can say that too. So I am in New York right now, and I saw an innovator yesterday who had a new material that, they're still going through R&D, but it's been about a year and a half they've been working on it, and they've come up with a really, really good product. I wouldn't be surprised if, within the next year or two, they were ready to start scaling. That's really quick compared to some of the companies have been on for a while and were leading in the space before. And so I imagine we're going to get more and more companies in the market, and we have seen that already within the last few years. A lot more companies entering the market. The way the market works with competition, right? The more competition it is, the better the products, right? The higher the scale, the lower the price. So that I'm very encouraged.
And the market set up in materials is actually better set up for that, because you do have those luxury good players. You do have those very niche products that can be kind of marketed. It's a bit more difficult in alternative proteins because, traditionally we've seen a lot of people going after the kind of the larger parts of the market, like ground beef and things like that. And actually, in order to allow that process of scaling up and getting better, you kind of really want to enter that top market first and then just kind of roll it out all the way along. So in some ways, materials is better set up. Whereas, we've seen it a little bit with things like collagen in food, but I think it's more interesting for me in some ways that textiles is, I feel like the natural industry structure is maybe more open or maybe easier. I can see it in my head more how that disruption would happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. With that. I think it's ripe much more than food is for that kind of cadence that you need, the speed for getting it to market.
What do you see as? I do agree, to be honest. But what surprised me really is that the idea of for the cell-based, the stuff that I'm working on, this idea has been around since 2013. The development of companies and the growth of companies in the meat space went on from there, kind of linearly or exponentially up till now, whereas cell-based leather, it's a handful of companies still, right? That has not seen the same growth as the cell-based meat companies, and it kind of always puzzled me because I expected that to go in parallel.
I think, again, like maybe we shouldn't lean too much on the examples of food, but, if you think of food, like a lot of the early success was kind of plant proteins. and then it was kind of hero proteins, like, you know, the Impossible Burger, the heme protein. And then, you know, the cultured protein still, like, it's still not quite there, but you can see it. You can kind of squint and you can probably see it coming. But if you think about it, like, there were a number of technical kind of evolutions that you needed to go through, especially like if we think of the kind of the acceptance of plant proteins now. You know, I always notice when I go to the supermarket, like maybe a couple of years ago, it was just kind of like, you know, a small section of the supermarket was plant protein. You go now, it's like, you know, 4 freezers full of plant proteins. And you know, you can see it kind of evolving, that there's going to be alternatives to that. We see the hero proteins with Impossible Burger and Beyond Burger. That's kind of, you know, with that. And I think the cultured protein is just one step behind that. And I think we can make the same analogies with the material side of things as well. A lot of the proteins that we see are kind of like plant proteins, and then there's kind of like the hero proteins. And I think there's a lot of different ways of making leather as well. So there is the cultured side of things, but there are other, like there's the obviously there's the mycelium kind of like way of making leather. There's the Scooby. So there's lots of different ways of making leather. And again, like, this comes back to making it better. So I we see a mashup of different technologies as well. So you know, we think there's going to be a cultured element to it, but also other kind of engineering biology applications coming in as well.
Yeah, but if you look at the plant-based protein sector, meat sector, has been around for 40 years, right? It has been around for a very, very long time. It's kind of grown very rapidly thanks to Beyond and Impossible for the last couple of years, but it has been baseline around for a very, very long time, catering to vegetarians and vegans primarily. Artificial leather, almost undistinguishable from the real thing, has also been around for as long as I can remember. So that must be at least 50 years. So those products are not particularly new. They have been around for a long time. And still, if you see that,
terrible. Like, I don't know if you remember, like plant burgers were terrible. Even just like they were very much for kind of vegan vegetarians. Like, they were kind of pretty bad for other folks.
Yeah, of course, the quality has improved, but especially the marketing has improved.
Yeah. But
because the first product from Beyond, the first product from Beyond and Impossible were also terrible.
These are brilliant examples, though, as a meat eater, that they're not as good as. So they're not. The whole point of disruption is it has to be better and cheaper. Now, obviously, how you define better depends. It's a hard thing to do, especially when it comes to food, because we're all subjective. I always say, like, if you try and tell someone what to eat, it's almost as bad as telling them how to parent. You know, so it's kind of that you know, there's a lot of emotion related to it. But arguably, you know, these are examples of, as Jamie said, disruption from below, where they're perhaps cheaper and then they get better. I mean, faux leather is a perfect example. I mean, arguably the leather market has already been disrupted, but because it wasn't better, all that happened was it almost opened up the industry. So you can now get faux leather everywhere. It's cheaper. And now, as you say, it's got a lot better and it's almost indistinguishable, but it's not better. And it's not better on a variety of functions, not just in terms of its quality, but also in terms of things like its environmental impact. And actually, when it comes to materials, we're starting to see quite a lot of regulation around materials that I think could kind of definitely switch perhaps away from those synthetic, when I talk synthetic, I mean plastic-based materials that are causing huge issues right at the end of life, which is not something we have to worry about so much with food, but with materials, you do have to worry about the end of life of your products. And I think that would definitely, back to your point, Stephen, really kind of fuel that bio-based revolution, as long as it's kind of biodegradable as well. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I saw a moment to talk about cheaper and better.
No, I think that makes a ton of sense. And actually, something that I think is different from in the fashion industry than food is that, at least when I was in food, you know, about 5 years ago, we did not have the big brands demanding these products, right? It really, like everyone's been talking about, is kind of ground up. This fashion industry, if you look at the panelists, you look at the attendees here, you look at the top brands who've already announced. I mean, Hermes has announced a partnership with Mica Works. I mean, we really do have the fashion industry demanding these materials, and that's a huge difference in food. I have been out of the food industry in a bit, but I still do think that, they're not seeing it as the future. It's just another option to offer customers, where I think it might be a little bit different in fashion.
Even more surprising that not more companies have stepped into this, right?
Well, actually, thank you, Mark, because that was another point I wanted to make, which was another difference that I see is in the fashion industry. I see a lot more companies in stealth mode. So, I mean, at least ones that have been working on this for a while, especially in cultivated leather. So companies who have been working on cultivated meat for a while and are now working on cultivated leather, but are not public about it. And we respect their privacy. We do not put them on our website. So if anyone's seen our list of innovators on our website, we have a specific list for cultivated leather companies. I know of at least 5 more that are not on there. And I wonder too, if they do have the money, they realize that they do need to work more on the development. They don't want to go to market yet until they have a more advanced product. But I think we're going to see a lot more coming on the market soon with materials that is further along.
And I love that we're kind of talking about the parallels between next gen materials and alt protein, and that there are some very interesting conversations to be had. But I do think it's really important to point out, and I think Stephen was saying this earlier, that there's also some things that we're just, are going to be apples to oranges, and we need to make sure that we're calling that out, which I'm glad that we're discussing as well. So for example, one of the things that we were just talking to a couple companies about is even within food, and I'm sure, Mark, you've experienced this as well, for food tech companies, for any industry, it's really important that we're not living in an echo chamber, right? And I think that we've all probably had this conversation with one another where we're around like-minded people, maybe have some varying opinions on things, but we tend to be able to live in this really amazing place and space where we're talking about things that we feel similarly aligned to. And then you talk to people outside of the space and you're like, oh my gosh, there's still so much work to be done, both of course in alt protein and in next gen materials. So when we were talking to some institutional investors, that are generalists, they're not focused on alternative protein, they're familiar with Beyond Meat and Oatly because they've exited, right? They hadn't even heard of Impossible Foods, which to me is just mind blowing, right? Because Impossible is so amazing and so integrated into so many drive-through menus, and it feels like it's mainstream, but they weren't aware of it, and so their only kind of benchmark is Beyond Meat and Oatly. And for even food tech companies, sometimes it's really hard for those types of investors to work with and understand that model is going to be different, that you're comparing apples to oranges even within alt protein. If they're saying, well, this is what Beyond Meat did, this is the path that they follow, this is what Oatly did, this is what their scale up looked like, this is what their infrastructure looked like, that's not there's only 2 comparisons, right? And so then they're kind of in this very heavy educational lift within the diligence process to explain that. And I think we're going to also, that's something that we're constantly talking about within Glasswell Syndicate, is because most of our investors are coming from the food side. It's great to pull the commonalities, but it's also really important to recognize that we do need to have partnerships with MII. And, we just launched this first ever MII Glasswell Syndicate committee for this exact reason, because we want to make sure that when we're partnering with startups, that our investors are genuinely value add, very strong in their portfolio management. And part of that is that huge educational component of understanding the differences in the diligence process and the difference in the type of investment that you're making and the difference in the structure and the strategy. There's just so many things for us to still figure out. And I think for most angel investors, food tends to be fairly intuitive. Like whether people join because they're mission aligned or just because they saw the data and the trends and they wanted to get involved and make investments in the space, it tends to be if you like the product, if you like the team, if you feel like they've got some, strong LOIs and they're pretty early on, then you might be willing to lean into that. Where, on the next gen material side, we're still trying to kind of figure out how to go through that diligence process because it may not be as intuitive. There's still so many things for us to learn. And obviously we rely heavily on the MII report. So thank you for that. But yeah, so there's that's something that we're still trying to kind of figure out and navigate. That's a little bit different, is there seems to be a lot of comparisons and made, and it's important to have that information, but it's also important to know that this is something different and exciting, and to make sure that we're doing our part to really understand it and be supportive of those entrepreneurs, because it's a new venture, which is exciting and requires a lot of support.
Oh, thank you, Macy. And actually, I thought it might be useful to go over just some general points about what we need to do to help encourage disruption in this industry. So I know you were just mentioning like helping investors understand the industry more. We could do some more for that. But in order to get to that costs and capabilities targets, is there anything else that you all could recommend on what we can do or the industry can do to help push this along?
One thing that we've struggled with some of the B2B super early stage, I mean, obviously we've seen the industry report, and there's, next gen material companies that have raised Series E rounds. So, our focus is obviously the much more early stage pre-seed, seed, some Series A companies. But one of the challenges that we've had is that a lot of times there is this demand, as you mentioned, from these brands. They want these materials, but they have certain run sizes that would be required for that the startup can't fulfill, and as they're trying to fundraise as investors, they want to see that those conversations are in place, but they need the capital to be able to scale. But they also are kind of relying on that investor making an investment with we may be able to, we may not be able to, and that makes it really complicated. So that's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately, is how we can get, big industry brands to maybe do smaller runs or things like that, just to get some proof of concept, and just to also be able to prove that there's going to be a huge first mover creating that FOMO. I think the rest of the industry will pick up with it, but it's just really, really tough. And I do think running that parallel to alt protein, I think that's next gen materials actually in a better spot, because I don't think that these brands are necessarily talking to everybody all at once. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's something that we definitely had to navigate in alt protein. That's always a little bit challenging, is because when you talk to companies, they're always, we're talking to Chipotle, we're talking to Subway, we're talking to McDonald's, we're talking to Wendy's. Those conversations take forever, and those companies are talking to everybody. And so it makes it really hard to navigate as an investor. But here we are seeing legitimate conversations and demand saying, we would love to do this, but you don't meet our run size. So that's been complicated, because without some sort of LOI or things like that, it can be challenging to get funding at the very early stage point.
Any other thoughts?
Maybe on a somewhat tangent, but in terms of kind of removing the barriers over the longer term to these disruptions, I mean, I think a number of things, but first and foremost, to think about the kind of communities affected and the people affected by this disruption, right? And I'm thinking mainly of food here, but I'm sure it applies to materials at some level, because there will be livelihoods turned upside down. There will be jobs lost, but so it's an interesting disruption in the food space, normally what you see is jobs destroyed in one area requiring one skill set, and jobs created somewhere entirely differently. It's somewhere entirely different, requiring completely different skills. I think what we'll see here is actually, as livestock particularly are disrupted, we'll see the potential to create jobs in exactly the same location, using very similar skills. If we choose to kind of rewild that land, or we choose to reforest it, or we choose to do whatever it is we do with it, we have the potential to create much kind of stronger communities, much better jobs for those people in those communities, and also at the same time reduce the resistance to change, because the agricultural lobby is a very strong lobby, and I think there's always fear of change. Right? People are always uncertain and resistant to any major change, especially when it affects their livelihood. And I think there's a job to be done very early in this cycle of reaching out to those communities and showing them that actually there is a better future, better jobs, in exactly the same locations, and I think that's a really important thing to do. And I think that that is never done 10 years in advance of a disruption. And I think you could get support across the board for the transformation. Actually, strangely, well, apart from small niches in the industry, support from a big part of the incumbent industry as well.
And Catherine, I saw that in your blog where you were talking about intersectional issues, and that's something we talk about on the food system all the time. Intersectional issues of the food system, and making sure that we're not just building, from big ag to big alt protein, right? And making sure within next gen materials as well. It's so early still that it's not just about having an opportunity, but it's a responsibility to create unwavering standards, and that's not just within that extends into labor and DIJ best practices, and really a huge responsibility. And I think to give credit here for this to Nicole here for this conference of like bringing those people together early and making sure that we're having those conversations at the start, because that's the time. Now is the time.
Another issue, sorry, just while we're kind of going off track a little bit, I think what we've seen in the energy space recently is yes, solar, wind are kind of the lowest cost form of generation today. They're still they're accelerating, and they're still having a tough time disrupting these markets, and that'll change soon, we think. But actually the biggest driver of change right now in that market is energy security. Right. I mean, we're seeing what's happening in Germany now. They've locked themselves into Russian gas, and they've suddenly realized that a conventional power system based on fossil fuels is deeply fragile. And the same goes for food. Right. It's quite likely that later this year we'll face some kind of food crisis, and same with all kinds of other materials. But these technologies allow us to localize production. Right? They're much more resilient. Right. They're all the inputs into that system are available locally. Right, in abundance, pretty much anywhere in the world. You can site these plants pretty much anywhere, and so they're far more secure than the supply chains, and they're far more resilient than the existing industry. And obviously, price is far less volatile, and that's one of the big issues that causes all kinds of social unrest and social problems around the world. And I think we don't do a great job in the novel protein space and in the materials space, which I know far less well, of pushing those benefits. I mean, it's better on every parameter. We have a ton of cards to play, not just the economic one, not just the environmental one, but the social card, the security card, the health card, all kinds of other messages that we should be pushing here, and generating support and reducing the resistance to this transformation.
Sounds like a good report I could ask your help for on Jamie.
I'd advise you to hire Catherine.
So we have a few minutes left. I do want to get to some of the audience questions, but I do want to also just remind the audience too that these are disruption experts who have experience in a variety of different industries. But this panel, out of probably the entire conference, has less experience, particularly in next-gen materials. So I am going to save some of those questions that are really on the next-gen materials industry. If you can, and save those for some other panels. I'll try and really talk about disruption of industries here. So one question that I'll pass to Catherine, is the shortened timeline to produce alternative leathers a potential disruption?
Yes. So in terms of the time to produce versus growing a cow, yes, exactly the same as for food. It just comes down to the efficiency question. So the efficiency of growing a cow, what it requires in terms of resources, then all the kind of processing that's required as well. If you're taking out a step of that, it's just efficiency. But it is quite hard to value that. So I think, because I wouldn't say it's well valued in cows at the moment. So, I think it's quite hard to value it. But in terms of, I guess, actually when it comes to consumer kind of the ability for the companies to kind of change their orders or say what they want, and then it gets growing quicker. So yes, it's definitely a potential disruptor.
Well, and we were talking a little bit about supply chain issues before. I know a lot of the fashion industry had supply chain challenges in COVID, with shipping out of China. Not only will I think, disruptions in this industry really help, but like Jamie was talking about, localized production as well. So Jamie, I have a question for you. So can you talk a little bit more about your assumption that ending the use of hides will have any effect on the price of meat?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the industry as a whole here rather than any specific part of the industry. But if something that was an asset, i.e. you could sell it, becomes a liability, you have to pay to dispose of it. That affects the profitability of the whole industry and presumably pushes up the price that you have to charge for the output. I mean, that's the point I'm making. If someone has a counter argument to that, I'm very happy to hear it. But it's that's the assumption that sits behind that comment.
Well, that makes, go ahead, Catherine.
I'll add. It's to do with the value of the cow as well. So the value of the cow, historically, we used it for food, fertilizer, energy, dowries. So they had a value. Storage of food, because you would feed your food. So, the value of a cow over the last many centenary has gone down, right? Because we just use it for food and a little bit material. So it's just taking away another of that kind of levels, and I'm talking about general cows. I mean, not all cows are just used for that, but I think if you're taking away a level, it's just, as Jamie said, you're just putting more, you have to get that value from one product alone, and that's why the meat's likely to increase in price.
Well, and I think Jamie's point too, that it really is interesting. The fashion industry is trying to stop using so much waste, which is why there is some excitement around these new next-gen materials that are using the agricultural waste streams, because they are finding a way to use something that we would otherwise, burn. And that is true with the hides, that if we are continuing to slaughter the animals, and you have to get rid of these hides, what do you do with it? You could bury them and they do biodegrade, but that takes time and it's cost. And it's likely somebody, like you said, Jamie, they would have to pay to dispose of. Anything else anyone wants to add on that, on the intersection of cows? And it could go the other way as well, right? I think, I don't know if everyone heard Barry's presentation earlier with Forager, but there are a lot of public statements, the UN encouraging people to eat less meat. There is a huge rise in the number of flexitarians with the introduction and now the widespread availability of the alternative proteins that really do mimic meat and carnivores enjoy eating them, that is going to also potentially reduce the consumption of beef. How would that similarly affect the cost of hides?
I also don't think that we can underestimate the power of Gen Z, which is something that we've definitely seen on the alt protein side. I know that we see within materials as well. The way that this new generation, which I'm a millennial, but Gen Z, like TikTok, I mean, just things move so quickly and they're so socially conscious. And something that we saw within alt protein was Gen Z was really training up. They were adopting more plant-based options into their day-to-day lives, and then they were telling their parents and telling their grandparents and telling the people that were making purchasing decisions, and now they're at an age where many of them are making their own purchasing decisions. And it's been really interesting to see the power of this new generation, and I think that has already played but will continue to play a really key part in materials, which is exciting.
Actually, I'll make one comment on that, and then I'll go back to the other question. So I have two boys. One's 10 and one's 12. And one of my 10-year-old friends came over, and we were making dinner, and I was making some plant-based chicken. And he said to me, "Do you know that currently we eat animals, but in the future our animal meat is going to come from plants?" And I was like, "Yes, I do know that." Thank you, 10-year-old. So
yes.
Definitely the future is aware of these issues.
And they're very aware too, obviously we're very heavily focused on the animal welfare aspect, but, they're aware of food waste. A third of all food produced is wasted. And so there's obviously a lot of parallels with how much waste there is within materials. And so I think that we're going to see a lot of push from Gen Z just being so hyper aware of that at younger and younger ages, that will drive a lot of change.
Okay. And then, if I could ask Catherine, you and Jamie.
The purchasers, which oftentimes are their parents.
If theoretically the worldwide consumption of beef goes down, how would you see that affecting leather prices?
I mean, it depends which leads which, right? If leather usage drops faster than beef consumption, essentially, it's highly unlikely that they just go down nicely in tandem, and the market will stay in balance. It's likely that one will go first and cause kind of reverberations through the market. I honestly couldn't call it. I mean, Catherine will have a better idea. I haven't looked deeply at materials at all, but I think I took from what you said earlier, Catherine, that maybe materials might go quicker.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well with materials, I think it's easier on the science to see it going quicker, but I think also materials has more flexibility built into its margins to if the price. So, for example, if we were to see food price, the cow meat side being disrupted quicker, actually probably what you'd see is all that would happen is people would stop using leather in the clothes except for the luxury sector, which has high margins anyway, so it could probably absorb those higher prices better than. You don't really see that kind of going on in the food sector as much. So I think the ability to absorb slightly higher prices in materials may mean it's okay as those new technologies scale up, but it would certainly kind of invigorate again, if it wasn't invigorated already, more and more companies looking for alternatives, for sure. I mean, of course, in a way, higher prices is better for alternatives because it's raising the bar, so it's kind of part of the it's that slightly ironic thing that higher prices can often help more disruption because essentially it's more incentivization to invest in it. But yeah, so I think I guess the point is materials probably has the ability to absorb it better and just take out any kind of cheap leather products. But I mean, yeah, I see them happening quite quickly together, but I think materials could definitely be faster.
Okay, then I'd like to pose one last question to all of you, which is remembering our audience. So we have a lot of investors, material companies, brands here. they're not disruption experts. Even though I've read every single one of like RethinkX's reports and Catherine's work, I am not a disruption expert. Coming from your perspective, is there any advice that you would give to all or any of these audiences on how to be prepared for a potential disruption in the materials industry? And Stephen, if you don't mind, I'll go to you first.
Well, I think to the general audience, I'd say like this is going to happen. So I you know, like there's no way this is not going to happen. I agree totally with a lot of what's been said on the panel, especially Catherine's comment that the material side of things is going to happen quickly. Like it doesn't have the regulatory aspect that food has. A lot of, as I said, a lot of the companies that look like they're going quicker are the ones that are able to scale. So from an investor point of view, we look at that very closely at how quickly they're able to sort of get to market. And the ones that have sorted out the scaling issue, they're the ones that are probably going to get to market first. And it is a race going forward. I think that's probably the main kind of observations I'd like to leave the audience with. Definitely oil economy, that's yesterday. Bioeconomy, that's today. Tomorrow, going forward, that's going to drive a lot of the disruption and economic progress going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. And Macy?
Yeah, so of course, my perspective is always through the lens of kind of playing matchmaker between innovative startups and mission-aligned investors. So really just we built Glasswall Syndicate very much with keeping in mind that it's about driving partnership. And your investor network is only as healthy as your relationship with startups. And so we've done a good job with that on the alternative protein side. But it's really important to us as a nonprofit that we are building a really good reputation with startups in this space. And so I guess my advice as far as next steps would be that if there are startups out there that are looking to fundraise, to please connect with us, because not only can we, potentially consider if a pitch day makes sense, we can, feature you on our open round board that goes to over 200 investors. But also with this new committee, a large part of that effort is just being able to provide resources and connections and insight. And what we've learned from Alt Protein in the very early days, like collaboration is really key, and having transparent conversations, and even startup to startup, like founder to founder, just saying like, hey, we are not, there's some IP we have to hold close, but we found some things that aren't working, or we found we found this really great accounting firm or whatever, just like little things like that, you always say a rising, tide lifts all boats. And we just really want to make sure that what we're building is truly supporting the industry. And even though it's an investor network, it's about the mission. And so I would just ask anyone whether they're an investor, they're a student, they're a startup, they're just excited about the space, like please connect with us. We're always happy to just have informal conversations too, and just bring passionate people together and talk about these things. I've learned that sometimes the most impactful, magical conversations actually happen like just in happenstance. You're on a call and you're like, wait, you're having this challenge, this person is having this challenge, like let's come together and figure some things out. And just within the network there's a lot of connections, and we're always happy to make those introductions. So that would just be my advice. Just please stay connected with us and let us know if there's anything we can do.
Oh, thank you so much for your support of the industry, Macy.
Of course.
Catherine.
I think just like a kind of closing thought beyond what I've said is, I think just trying to, and I've seen this at Planet Track a little bit, because just the idea of utilizing brands as investors in their own supply chains. And I think trying to get brands as partners in these supply chains is going to be incredibly important going forward. I'm sure this is the dream for a lot of companies anyway, so perhaps I don't need to say it. And then just beyond that, as companies just look and think about to that 15, 20 years, what do you want the industry to look like, and how are you going to get there, and what are the products you could be making, and are we going to be sitting in all alt material cars, or I don't know what the next plan is. So what's the next coffee cups made from old leather. I don't know.
I'm here for it.
I will say too, I mean, I think most of our audience here is fashion industry, but we talk to the automotive industry too. And wow, they are really excited about this industry. I think it's going to take a lot of scale to be able to serve them with all their needs. But yeah, I can't even imagine what this is going to look like. Yeah, Jamie, and I'll leave it to you for some closing thoughts.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Nicole, and thank you to my fellow panelists. It's been fun. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I've learned a lot. So I guess what I'd say is be careful in many ways. I mean, as Stephen said, this will happen. We can argue about the timing, but there's an inevitability to this. I mean, it's kind of like trying to make a faster horse. You can't really make an order of magnitude more efficient cow. This is happening. But we've seen in other industries, a lot of money's been lost. I mean, solar's been a massive growth story. A huge amount of money has been lost there because the value chain of the new industry looks nothing like the value chain of the old industry. And so if all you're doing is looking, through the lens of the old industry, you might make some huge mistakes. And I think spend some time understanding what the new might look like. I think I used the analogy of the butterfly earlier on, but it's a different beast. It's a different thing, and understanding where the value sits in that emerging industry is critical, because it might not be where you think it is.
I'm going to go find that quotation from Buckminster Fuller. Thank you so much, Jamie. And yeah, thank you all so much. I really appreciate you joining today and providing your expertise. And I really do recommend everyone read Catherine's blog posts and the RethinkX. Basically, all of their reports are amazing. And so right now we actually are moving to our first speed networking session. So this is a chance for us to connect one-on-one with other attendees online today. And during the speed networking, attendees are automatically matched based on their interests. So again, when you signed up, you should have clicked who you are and who you'd like to meet with. So to access the speed networking, please click on the networking button on the left-hand side of your screen. In this networking room, you'll also see a list of recommended connections. So if you prefer to use this time to meet one-on-one with select attendees, you can schedule these meetings as well. All right. Thank you all so much. See you soon.